stopping at 2:16 a.m., that tiny metal hand frozen like a witness. The power went out. Wind clawed at the porch. My mother crept through the dark with a ledger tucked under her arm, numbers and names in a hand that trembled just enough to be human. She taught me to hide under the bed and whisper the escape route into my pillow. She taught me how to breathe so you wouldn't hear you were alive. Then someone knocked. He didn't sound like a robber. He sounded polite, like a man with a list. My father opened the door and smiled the way men smile when they mean to silence trouble. What followed was quick and terrible. The scraping of chairs, my brother's whimper, and my mother's single brave plea. They thought it was safe. The Secret Family Massacre ***. First person / true crime style narrative. They say memory is a house with many rooms. Some we never enter again. Others we live inside forever. The night it all ended. The storm hammered on the roof like a warning no one could read. The power went out at 2:16 a.m. I know that because I kept a little analog clock by my bed after the first blackout that winter. A clock you can trust when everything electric betrays you. Claire Hartman is my name. When the lights went out and our world split, I was 8 years old. I'm telling you this now because someone has to. Because the truth has teeth and it will not be softened by time. Because justice needed a witness. We were the ideal family, according to the neighborhood, the PTA, and neighbors who waved across manicured lawns. Daniel Hartman, my father, had broad shoulders and was quick to shake hands. He always smelled faintly of motor oil and lemon cleaner. Linda, my mother, smiled in family photos like a stormy person does and wore apron-like armor. Aaron, my brother, was 5 years old and brave. Sophie, our baby sister, was 30 months of softness and breath. Outside of town, the house had wide porches, oak trees, and a slate roof that blew beautifully. There, isolation appeared to be peace. It looked like safety. Everything else looked like a postcard. Kids with cookies, candlelit birthdays, lawn chairs at dusk. But postcards are printed on thin paper. They tear. The ledger that my mother kept under the loose floorboard in the mudroom would be the one thing I could make everyone who ever met us see. She called it paperwork when people asked, a sensible, practical word that hid frantic handwriting. The mortgage balances, late fees, and scribbled-in pencil hush payments were displayed in the ledger in carefully arranged columns. Names, unusual names next to household expenditures. Threatened visits due by dates, and threats written in the margins in a shaky hand when she couldn't sleep. Those pages were her secret. She hid them because she thought secrecy could buy us time. That winter, the numbers were getting sharp and hungry. The 1st and 15th checks that used to arrive on time now don't. There were late notices from the bank and a terse envelope with the word final stamped across it. We were told not to worry by my father. When he realized that we couldn't see, his jaw became icy. He claimed control of everything. But under control is something men say when they're clutching at a rope they can't see, so others won't know they are falling. My mother noticed things. She was the sort of person who noticed the small differences that grew into catastrophes. The mail that smelled of other hands, the truck that idled too long down the lane, and the man who said he was there to make an adjustment and measured the porch with his eyes. She started hiding, small things at first. A typed page of names behind an atlas. She once hid a gun beneath the laundry room's wash basin by wrapping it in towels. Not because she wanted it, but because she saw fear in my father's face the way you see lightning before it hits. She planned, quietly, late at night while the children dreamed and the baby sighed. I remember her voice like a thread. If it ever comes to it, we leave at dawn. We leave everything. She taught Aaron where to go if he heard shouting. She taught me to whisper the numbers of the house into the plants so they would have something to remember. She packed small things into a suitcase and moved them back again. A mother does this when she cannot solve the problem. She prepares an escape. When I was old enough to know what the word creditor meant, it had already stained our lives. My father owed more than we had. In addition to the mortgage, there were other debts that were whispered about in dimly lit barrooms. Loans with names that tasted like sulfur. He said he had investments that would come through. He claimed he had a strategy. Similar to how people say, "I'm sorry." Men like him say, "I can fix it." This becomes ritual rather than truth. He started saying it more loudly as winter wore on. He would come home after dusk with his coat zipped up and his jaw tight and insist on discussing taxes and work in the kitchen at midnight. A suit-clad man once approached the back door and said, "Hartman, we need to talk about arrangements." My father smiled with the forced civility of someone removing a rattlesnake. "I'm on top of it," he said, and closed the door. That night my mother didn't sleep at all. She walked the house like a sentinel, listening for the wrong footsteps. The pride of my father became a kind of darkness. The small, private system of beliefs that tells a man he must not show weakness, even to his family, is not macho pride. When the papers came marked final, when the sheriff's deputy came to the porch in a gray suit and told him the foreclosure date was set, my father shut us down. He did not inform the neighbors. He turned down assistance from friends who offered to speak with the bank. He wouldn't accept a simple loan from a relative that might have saved us. He said, "We don't need charity," and his voice had a brittle edge that made my mother look at the floor. That brittle edge is what broke the household. She tried privately, quiet phone calls, envelopes with cash hidden under the sofa cushion. She started making plans for an exit that wouldn't require his permission as soon as she started keeping the gun and the ledger. She whispered to me in the pantry, "If it comes to it, you must wake up Aaron. You must get Sophie. Don't make any noise." She taught me how to open the back gate quietly and where to put our shoes so we could run faster by the screen door. She scrawled the route to my aunt's house on the back of an old receipt and put it in her bra. This is what mothers do. They create maps out of desperation. But my father would not let her use the car without him. He refused to meet with the lawyer my mother's sister offered to call. He refused to do anything. File for chapter. "We'll handle this ourselves," he said, while a kind of quiet panic replaced the authority his smile used to give. He painted over their fear with a performance of control, and we all fell into the act because it was less frightening than the truth. He was at war with people who do not accept a stalemate. If you want to understand how an ordinary house can become a crime scene, you have to know something about escalation. Threats arrive first as words, the late-night calls where nobody speaks, only heavy breathing. Then they become footsteps outside, then scratches along the fence, then the envelope with a small, clean hole burned into it like a warning, a single bullet hole through paper, nothing else. Those were seasonal, small aggressions. But when a person in debt finds himself facing people who deal in fear, the stakes change fast. The men who come for money never really come alone. They bring men who keep no calendar, and they are not suited to kindness. The night of a storm, my mother was awake when the power went out. The house sighed in the dark. I remember the way the oak branches tapped the windows like fingers. She woke me and Aaron and told us to stay in our beds. "Do not make noise," she said. She spoke with a calm tone, like a thin, taut wire before breaking. "Hide if someone comes. Beneath your bed. Do you understand me?" We heard the car first, a rumble swallowed by rain. The porch light flickered and died. My father came down the stairs. There was mud on his boots and a new bruise on his knuckle. He smelled like rain and oil. He told us everything was under control and that we should go back to sleep. My mother pressed her lips together and stared at him like she could will him into honesty. After giving her a quick kiss, he left to check the boiler. When he went outside, the world seemed to hold its breath. She moved like a woman with instructions from a map only she could see. She opened the mudroom, pulled up the board, and slid the ledger into the lining of her coat. She took the small pistol she had wrapped in cloth and pushed it into the bottom of her purse, where the fabric muffled its shape. She murmured again about the plan about dawn, about the back gate, about my aunt's house, a place with lights and straight roads, and people who would stand between us and the men with no mercy. "Stay under the beds no matter what," she told us, and Aaron whimpered. I fell asleep with my voice like a pebble in my throat. She had the look of someone who had practiced grief and rescue as one act. Diane, my mother's sister, would later say, The most bizarre aspect of her is that she could simultaneously represent hope and preparation. We were not prepared for what followed. There was a knock at the back door at 3:02 a.m. 3:02. It was not the careful knock of a neighbor. It was a polite request disguised as a command. There was a man's voice outside, low, saying, "Daniel Hartman, open up. We have business to settle." The door was answered by my father. I remember the muffled exchange, a voice that wasn't ours, my father's voice controlled, then higher, then suddenly cut. The door slammed shut. A sound I did not recognize because it did not belong in our life. A sound like a heavy branch hitting wood, like someone hitting a body. I sat up in the dark, and every part of me became acoustic. The infant began to cry. If there had been a way to warn them, to stop them, my mother would have found it. She crept from the hallway and tried to open my father's bedroom door. It wouldn't budge. The knocking recommenced, more insistent, like a storm seeking entry. People make decisions that cannot be reversed in those split seconds. My mother moved toward the kitchen trying to dial, but the handset was dead. No dial tone. The rain had knocked out more than lights. I can tell you, as precisely as memory allows, what I heard next. A voice barked a name, Daniel, and the murmured reply of my father. Then a sound like furniture being thrown, and someone saying, "We warned you. This is how it is going to be." It is a cliché to say the house fell silent, but the silence that followed felt like the kind of absence that announces a change in gravity. There are things you will not hear again in your life. I will never unhear the sound of suppressing fingers on a mouth, the hush of a small foot on hardwood as a child crawls under a bed, or hot breath on a backside as someone tries to keep still. I will never unsee the shape of my mother in the dim hall, clutching a purse like a talisman, the ledger faintly visible at the edge of her coat. I will never forget the thing that came through the kitchen door. Not a man at all. No, it was all brusque motion and dark clothes, a voice clean as a razor. Because he had already paid to make other people fear it, he entered the building acting as though he owned it. Confrontation is not cinematic. It's a mess. It is clipped commands, the smell of sweat and rain, and a lamp overturned. The room was transformed into a series of seconds that you can't collect again after the man in the darkness produced a weapon made of metal that caught lightning through the window. My mother begged. I could see her lips moving, but I could not hear the words over the thump of my heart. The two men, the intruder and my father, argued with a cold, businesslike cadence of predators. With his hands out, my father attempted to stand between them. "We can work something out," he said. I overheard him praying the words. The man's response was straightforward. No more time. And then something broke. Pride broke apart like ice. I saw the other man move with practiced ease as my father lunged, not out of reason, but out of rage. A weapon came into view, a flash, and my father collapsed like someone folding a chair. There was more noise than could be borne. Furniture scraping. My mother's scream torn off in the middle. I saw the intruder pivot, and something wild and impossible happened. My mother stepped forward, a small woman facing a large ruin, and she reached out like someone warding off an animal. She said, "Take everything. Take it. Please do not harm my children. The conditions of our bravery are not up to us to choose." She tried to negotiate with the thing that makes deals break. He pushed her aside with the casual force of someone cleaning a table. There was a sound, a real terrible sound, and then a long, soft bloom of silence that settled across the stairway. I remember pulling the bed sheet over my head for a moment, because you think if you cannot see it, it might not be happening. Then there was a heavy, dull thud, the sound of the baby monitor hitting the floor. Sophie's cries stopped, and I wanted to crawl into the floor where the ledger kept its secrets. I kept my hand on the mattress fabric like a prayer. When the intruder left, he didn't leave quietly. He left with the businesslike indifference of a man who has closed an account. He left in a car that sped down the gravel without headlights, spitting rain behind it. The door slammed. The hallway was free of my father's breath. When the dawn finally broke, it found the house we once adored folded in on itself. Due to her stubbornness, my mother had clung to the edges of the air and was barely alive when the detective arrived. She died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, clutching the ledger like a talisman against nothing. I woke under my bed to the sound of someone calling my name, a voice that was no longer my father's. It was Detective Marcus Hale, who had the look of someone who had seen 100 broken things, but had not yet put them all back together. He did not flinch when he saw the room and pulled me out of the light and dust. As a token of his kindness, he blanketed me. He asked questions, soft and precise. Aaron was lying in his bed, his face as white as a small moon from sleep. In her tote, Sophie was quiet, and her breath was warm and consistent. They had survived, which is some terrible mercy. Hale remained as a detective. He performed his duties as if he detested incomplete narratives. He examined the porch and the broken lock. He discovered tire tracks in the mud and slugs in the flower bed, both of which pointed to a daylight readable vehicle without a license. He found footprints that did not belong. He listened to the sheriff and the neighbor talk about the suit-wearing man who had been there a week earlier and asked polite questions. Under the ambulance seat that my mother had been cradling, he discovered the ledger concealed within her coat in a plastic bag. The ink was running like tears, and it was wet. In the days after, the house smelled of bleach and cedar and the things people used to try make evil smell less like itself. The coroner showed up and left. The funeral was small and lit with too much sympathy. Detectives moved through photographs and interviews like surgeons. They had to reconstruct a life out of receipts and threats, out of the way my father had signed his name on mortgage papers with a hand that was not steady. The detective, Marcus Hale, showed me how they conduct interviews, conduct background checks, keep call logs, and track financial transfers. He read names out of the ledger like coordinates, treating it like a map. The ledger told a clearer story than my father's bravado ever would have. There were entries that read like a ledger, payments, notes about settlement, and a name, R. Caro, repeated in the margins. There were phone numbers and the word visit scribbled next to dates. There were also notes in my mother's handwriting. He says he can handle it. And I pay $300 this week, leaving $100 spare. The handwriting was small, the arithmetic careful. It was a plan. It was also proof. Detective Hale found a paper trail. With small, stubborn patience, he traced the numbers to a man named Richard Caro, a mid-level collector for a company that made informal loans with interest rates that ate people's lives. Caro had been the one to go to the porch earlier, greeting everyone with a friendly smile. He had called my father at all hours. He had been at the office the day the foreclosure notice went through. It was known for Caro to send men without asking questions. He had a past, convictions for assault, lampied over in old police sheets. He denied everything when they asked him, but his denials were like thin curtains over a room that reeked. You will be told by the prosecution that a case is only as good as the witnesses who testify, and witnesses are fragile. I was 9 when they asked me to come to court. The courtroom smelled like varnish and coffee. I sat with my aunt and my lawyer and watched the men with clipped hair and hard suits sit like puppets on stage. The truth came in fits and starts after the district attorney summoned witnesses to the stand. They contacted a bank official to inquire about the timetable. They called a neighbor to say he had seen Caro car the week before. They called a forensic analyst to testify about DNA and fingerprints found on the doorframe where Caro had reached. But the heart of the case was not the DNA. The ledger, which was written by my mother, and my testimony formed the core of the case. I was 13 when we faced Caro in court. Time is both a bomb and a wound. I would later learn that the man who had walked into our kitchen was not Caro alone. He was with others, an enforcer from a crew who worked on behalf of the loan company. I recognized the voice in the kitchen as that of a local named Leary, who had a history of violence. Leary was the one who'd moved with that practiced cruelty. He was the one who had executed the threat. In court, I told everything. I told the judge about the door at 3:02 a.m. I told the jury I saw my father's face for the last time on the linoleum. I told them about my mother and the ledger. I spoke only about the facts that could be tested, times, names, and numbers. and I was unable to speak clearly about the things that a child sees and interprets. But between the lines, I said more. I said the most dangerous things of all, that fatherly pride had kept us from asking for help, that his stubbornness had sealed our fate, that my mother had tried to leave us a way out she could not use because my father refused permission. The jury heard me, and you would be surprised how much an adult world listens when innocence speaks truth. The defense tried to paint my father as a man who had angered people without meaning to, as a homeowner who had a run of bad luck. They tried to dissociate the ledger. Maybe she kept records for a different reason, they suggested. They argued the intruders had been random criminals. But evidence is patient, and evidence is precise. Caro calls were logged. The payrolls of the men who showed up had suspicious entries. Leary had an old arrest record, and a bloodied shirt was found in his apartment during a search. Caro had been taking payments from accounts tied back to my father's company, payments that stopped the second week after the murder. We found out that Caro Company had been putting pressure on Hartman to settle the case sooner rather than later and for larger sums of money. When asked why their collectors resorted to brutality, the company lawyer gave the rehearsed answer. We employ third-party agents for collection. We cannot control every element. They ultimately indicted Caro and Leary and 2 others on charges of murder, conspiracy, and a litany of lesser crimes. The trial lasted months. Detective Hale testified. He had a way of talking that was both clinical and human. He told the story of a ledger like someone solemnly reading a will. He said, "This was not a spontaneous robbery. These were men sent to collect what they considered owed." The jury viewed the footage of our house, including the muddy porch and broken phone. And then here is the twist the world will love to retell. The judge allowed into evidence a series of emails we had found on a backup drive. They were rough drafts of deals that my father had made, work contracts for borrowing money from a line that was connected to Caro lenders. Money my father had taken in the name of business expenses. He had believed that the money would become something else. The prosecution argued that my father had, in his stubborn pride and secrecy, hidden the fact that he had signed the business to backers who would not be satisfied with lectures or phone calls. He had promised them returns that he was unable to provide. He had been desperate. That desperation made enemies. The defense said these were business mistakes, not grounds for murder. However, the ledger and indications of danger connected the threads. In the end, Caro was convicted of conspiracy to commit robbery and second-degree murder. Leary and 1 accomplice were convicted of murder. The murderer, who was identified by forensic evidence and his blood-stained shirt, was found guilty and given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The company faced fines and a civil suit. The justice system moved in its deliberate gears, and the people who came to our house in the dark were punished in light. My mother was not brought back by it. It did not stretch my father's chest to life, but it put names on the faces that had visited us at night. The trial revealed other things too. The bank's foreclosure had been the catalyst, but the rot had been deeper. My father had taken shortcuts, hiding payments, and engaging in deals that were morally dubious and financially reckless. He had refused help because admitting that he needed it would have been to admit failure. He had refused to include my mother's family because he wanted to dictate the narrative. Control is its own kind of cage. In the end, his need to control had made him blind to the more important need, to protect his family by any means necessary. When the gavel fell, I felt something like relief, but also something like compounded loss. The children testified, Aaron, less precise than I, and still carrying the shapes of nightmares, and Sophie, who could not remember much, but whose presence was the kind of raw evidence that makes juries soften. Aaron's voice trembled when he said he had seen a man in a dark jacket, and how he had heard a loud noise. The jury listened. They did not always get the nuance of fear, but they took what they could. In the end, the law did what it could with what it had. It named the guilty, it punished them, and it started repairing the edges. Afterwards, we moved. While social services assisted with housing, Aunt Diane cared for the children. We sold the house at auction for less than the bank wanted. People sent casseroles and checks and small notes. So sorry, and we're praying for you. The language of distant sympathy. Detective Hale maintained contact. He attended the funeral and sent me a card with a pencil sketch of an oak tree on it and a note. Truth is heavy. Carrying it makes you stronger. I keep that card in a box with the pages from my mother's ledger. There's a lesson I learned from a ledger, from a trial, from the smell of bleach in the parlor after the coroner left. It is a lesson about illusion versus reality. As many people do, my father had maintained the impression that everything was fine. He kept an elaborate mime of normalcy, barbecues, repair projects, and school volunteer hours, while underneath his pride and fear, he had been making deals that made enemies for the people he loved. Perfectionists frequently do so to conceal the escalating disaster. We use illusion as a social currency to avoid difficult conversations. But illusions are not harmless. They are lies with collateral. Additionally, it teaches secrets. My mother hid the ledger because she thought secrecy would save us. With the limited authority she had, she did what she could. Secrets in a marriage can be protective, but they can also be suffocating. They can make you think you are the only one who can fix something you cannot fix alone. When my father refused help, he refused the net that might have caught us. Pride can be a weapon as lethal as any gun. In the end, justice was served because someone took notes, a child remembered dates and names, and a detective was determined. But justice is not the same as healing. Healing is a gradual and ongoing process. We tell the story because to tell it is to wash it with light. When the jury named the guilty men, my mother's hope that someone would at least be held accountable was vindicated in the narrowest sense. The law named faces and assigned them punishment. That is a kind of closure, but not the whole thing. Closure is not a destination. It is a recurring appointment. People sometimes ask me why I tell this story, why I have made a home of the memory like an old photograph kept on the mantle. I tell it because illusions are contagious. I tell it because pride and secrecy will swallow families whole if we let them. I tell it because mothers plan in ways we cannot imagine, and sometimes still their plans cannot work. I tell it so that other families might see the ledger before it becomes an epitaph. Due to Detective Marcus Hale's persistent inquiry, what did you remember? I tell it. Moreover, the world provided me with a means to organize chaos through that question. After the trial, there was a brief moment when the world seemed a little more open. I stood in the courtroom with my hands folded and watched the men led away. They were not monsters out of myth. They were men in suits and a man with the hard face of someone who had stopped feeling, who had taken orders from men in polished offices. The judge looked tired and firm. My aunt's hand was warm on my shoulder. The dust appeared golden as the sun shone across the windows. A child in the back of the courtroom laughed at an absurdity, and the sound was ordinary and beautiful. For a moment, I believed that justice did its small, crude work and that the world could be made marginally safer. Years later, I have learned to live inside a house that does not tremble with secrets. I teach other kids to read. I keep a small notebook where I write down numbers and names, not because I fear collecting debts, but because paper is a useful thing. I teach my students to be curious, to ask not only how but also why. When people ask me what the takeaway from what happened is, I tell them this. Within a family, trust is both fragile and immense. It can save you or it can blind you. Pride and secrecy narrow your options. Asking for help widens them. If you feel the floorboards shake, say so. Double the caution when someone suggests a quick solution that necessitates secrecy. If your neighbor knocks with polite smiles and questions about arrangements, pay attention. Not because you should live in fear, but because life sometimes asks you to be brave and ordinary at the same time. My mother died holding a ledger. My father died with the weight of his pride on his chest. The men who came for us at night were held accountable in court. The testimony of the children who were still alive became the bright, thin thread that brought the truth out of the shadows. The truth was told, and not the world was made whole. Justice, messy and not perfect, arrived and helped us make sense of the wreckage. If there is a final lesson I can offer you, quiet, like a lantern in the fog, it is this. Safety is not a design you can draw on a postcard. Safety is spoken for, negotiated, and sometimes painfully rebuilt. It demands honesty with those you live with, and an acceptance that pride should never stand on principles that risk lives. Secrets can sometimes shelter. More often they rot the foundations. Say what needs to be said. Ask for help. And when the storm comes, because storms always come, let the people who love you know where the ledger is. I tell this story to honor those we lost and those who refused to let their memory fade. Linda Hartman, mother, planner, quiet hero, fought with every small, brave thing she had to protect her children. She kept the ledger not as a secret to shame, but as a map of the danger she saw coming. She packed a suitcase, taught escape routes, and gave her last breaths clutching proof that would name the men who stole our safety. Her courage is the heart of this story. My father, Daniel, was a complicated casualty of pride. He loved us in the only way he knew how, by holding control, and that refusal to ask for help became a tragic force that closed options and widened enemies. He is not absolved, but his memory is a warning. The cost of secrets can be greater than the shame they try to hide. There are heroes who answered the wound with light. Detective Marcus Hale pursued the truth when others would have let it lie, turning a soaked ledger and a frightened child's memory into a case that held names and made men accountable. Aunt Diane opened her home and her heart when our world fell apart. Social workers, neighbors, and the small team who pieced together phone records and tire tracks turned grief into justice through grit and compassion. And the children, Aaron, little and courageous. Sophie, too young to carry all of this, but brave in survival. And I, who spoke the facts in court, became the fragile witnesses who forced daylight into shadowed corners. In the end, the law named the guilty, and the men who came in the night were punished. That conviction cannot bring back Linda or mend everything Daniel's pride destroyed, but it does mark a moral reckoning. The ledger spoke, the detective listened, and the courtroom answered. This is both a tribute and a charge, to remember the dead, to honor the living who stood up, and to carry forward the hard lesson that asking for help is sometimes the bravest thing a family can do. For more stories like this, subscribe to the Famographic Show to show us love. Thanks for watching.